All right, it's 11:01 on a beautiful, hazy Virginia day. We'll go ahead and get rolling because I know we've got a pretty packed agenda for this panel. So I'll just start by welcoming everyone to our panel on performance-based regulation and kind of an introductory session here. My name is Peter Anderson. I am the Virginia Policy Director with Appalachian Voices. I'm based in Charlottesville, Virginia. I've been working here since 2016, and part of what I do is focus on electric utility regulation. I'm joined by several esteemed colleagues here. And so let's see, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to pass the mic around to everyone, but I know I'm supposed to introduce the panelists. So you're going to be hearing today from Laura Gonzalez Guerrero with Clean Virginia. And just as a quick bio, Laura is the Energy Policy Manager at Clean Virginia, where she works on electric utility regulation and policies for an affordable clean energy transition. You're also going to be hearing from two of the folks at RMI. So Kaya Rebane is a senior associate at RMI in the carbon-free electricity practice. And Kaya's work focuses on reforming utility regulatory policy and business models to reduce carbon emissions and to promote a just transition to a clean energy future. Prior to joining RMI, Kaya conducted econometric modeling and policy analysis at the Pacific Economics Group Research. And she's joined by her colleague, Janelle Wilson. Hi, Janelle. Thank you for joining us. Also a senior associate in RMI's carbon-free electricity practice, where she focuses on reforming utility business models using performance-based regulation and incentive mechanisms to foster a swift transition to zero emissions electricity. Prior to joining RMI, Janelle worked for the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University. And in that role, she designed and provided research support for the North Carolina Energy Efficiency Roadmap. We hope to be joined also by Nicholas Crowley, who I will introduce later on when we get there. So let me go ahead and for right now, let me turn it over to Laura, who's got some introductory sort of remarks on Virginia, why we're here, and what we're trying to accomplish today. So Laura, welcome, and go ahead. Take yourself off mute, Laura.
Thank you. Oh my gosh, 2 years and still not knowing how to unmute myself. Thank you, Peter, and I'm very grateful to all the participants for their time, to Janelle, Kaya, Nick, and Peter for being here with us today. The driving force behind this webinar is the recently passed legislation in the Virginia General Assembly, specifically Senate Bill 1265 and its companion House Bill 7070. So this legislation orders the State Corporation Commission to open a regulatory proceeding where the commission will set performance metrics that will be used to penalize or reward utilities with up to 50 basis points above or below the utilities' authorized profits. These performance metrics may include, but are not limited to, factors like reliability, customer service, and operating efficiency. I would like to talk a little bit about the timeline of this proceeding. The State Corporation Commission will start this proceeding before December 31st, and it could last between 1 or 3 years. If the process is completed in the next year and a half or so, the first time we will see these metrics in action will be during the biennial review of rates for Dominion and Appalachian Power Company in 2025. But why is it important to think about performance-based regulation overall for investor-owned utilities? In general, our hope and what we want is our utilities to transition towards a reliable, efficient, and not polluting energy system that swiftly integrates innovations like distributed solar, battery storage, microgrids, demand response, and do so at the least cost with the highest social, technical, and environmental standards. However, the misalignment of these goals with how the utilities make money is slowing us down. We cannot ignore the existing regulatory and economic incentives that have propelled utilities' behavior for decades. The once useful cost of service model only compensates utilities for owning and expanding capital-intensive projects. And although it was instrumental for the early development of our energy system, this model is becoming an obstacle for affordability, sustainability, reliability, and other important goals. So these cost of service models allow utilities to recover all its costs with almost zero risk and a profit margin based on the price of capital investments. The more expensive the project is, the more profits the utility collects. With this model, utilities can ensure financial stability and consistent returns to investors without considering the long-term risk of pollution, the risk of stranded assets due to new regulation, the risk of cost overruns, etc., because these risks are simply passed to customers. And I want to say the last bad thing about this model, so bear with me. The incentives of this model are so strong that encourage and reward overinvestment and inefficient investments. New technology has opened up opportunities for families, businesses, and industries to benefit from producing energy with lower pollution. However, again, we have economic incentive embedded in our regulations for utilities to be an obstacle for customers to install rooftop solar, communities to use microgrids, and other distributed resources like energy efficiency. In other words, to sum up, there is no clear connection between the energy goals for our Commonwealth and the utilities in financial incentives. So this proceeding, the proceeding that the Commission will open up soon is an opportunity to start thinking how we can correct this misalignment. However, as we will discuss in these panels, this effort requires time, multiple steps, stakeholder engagement, and very careful analysis. Lastly, before we get into the meat of the presentation, I want to mention that this is not the first time we talk about performance-based regulation in Virginia. In 2012, the Commission opened a similar proceeding, and the Commission staff did a fantastic job gathering stakeholder comments, and many organizations participated. The final regulations require utilities to file critical information needed to establish performance metrics. However, after the regulatory process was completed, the law changed, impeding the implementation of these information requirements. This is a valuable experience that can guide us to see what went well and what must improve. And with all these tools, we can use the upcoming proceeding as an opportunity to first understand the current regulatory structure and the economic incentives it creates, and second, restructure those regulatory and financial incentives around the goals we have for Virginia's energy system. So without further ado, I'm very excited to pass the mic to Kaya and Janelle from RMI.
Great. Thank you so much for that preamble, Laura. That was a wonderful segue into the content that Kaya and I will be presenting in just a moment. So I just want to quick check that folks can see the full version of the slides. They're seeing the right version? Okay, fabulous. So then we'll get started. So I'm Janelle Wilson. My colleague Kaya will be coming on to speak in just a moment. And thank you, Peter, for those introductions as well. Here we are. So what are we here to talk to you about today? Well, we have two core objectives that we hope align with why you're here. One is to support creation of a shared understanding of what performance-based regulation is and why it can be valuable, or why it's desirable, in fact. The second objective is to help you leave this conversation with the solid theoretical understanding of the benefits, some of the trade-offs as well, of PIMs, of scorecards, and metrics. And we'll ground that theoretical conversation in some real-world examples of PIMs in other jurisdictions. So in service of those objectives, we'll talk about utility regulation in its current state. We'll talk about key regulatory reform tools and the full suite of options that are available. And then we'll drill down and talk about some PIM examples in other jurisdictions before opening the floor to Q&A. So we won't address any Q&A until after our presentation, but feel free to use the Q&A functionality in Zoom to go ahead and just populate any question you have as you have them throughout our presentation. And maybe we can address them in real time when we're trading off speaker roles. So before we get started, I'd like to invite you all to answer a check-in question in the chat. And this is to help us understand what brought you here today. So the question is, what are you most hoping to learn from this session? And if you could use the chat function and type in why you're here, what you hope to learn, I would love to hear some of your perspectives. We'll take a minute or two for this. All right, great. So one person is interested in learning implementation challenges of PBR and the interplay of state-based PBR with organized market dynamics. So we'll definitely talk about some implementation challenges today. I think we'll want to put in the parking lot for a future conversation, Laura, talking about how PBR can interplay with market dynamics. That's a really great point and deserving of a whole nother conversation. Another person is interested in learning more about different approaches to PBR. We'll definitely cover that a little bit today, but I think there's a lot more to be said. So curious for questions on that topic. The devil's in the details. How do you ensure properly designed PBR system? Cassidy, I love that metaphor. It's absolutely accurate with PBR in my experience. The devil is absolutely in the details. And there's a lot more to be said about how to design PBR with those details in mind. We won't be able to touch on all of that today, but certainly there are a lot of resources available externally that we can point you to after this presentation that go into those details. Metrics for performance, how they're judged and how we are okay if the IOU earns 15% on the old scale. We'd love to hear a little bit more about that question, but we'll definitely talk about metrics and performance today. All right, lots of good thoughts coming in about what people are hoping to learn today. Thank you so much for sharing that. What we don't cover today, hopefully Rachel, Kaya and I can be available after this conversation if you'd like to email us, and we can hopefully address your questions or point you to other resources. All right, so with that, we'll go ahead and get started with the big picture of utility regulation.
Thanks, Janelle. Yeah, so right now we're just going to take a little bit of a step back, look at how utility regulation has worked and generally does work now before we jump into the question of what should we do in terms of reforms. So as I think for probably most folks in this call are aware, utility regulation has been around quite a while, about a century, give or take. And historically, it's been fairly narrowly focused on a handful of different objectives, including safety and reliability, affordability, and ensuring universal energy access, meaning that everybody, even if you live in a really rural area, gets electric service or gas service or what have you. That said, while those are still important objectives today, things have changed. What we care about today has shifted a bit for some social reasons, for other reasons like the fact that now we're aware that climate change is a real concern. We're aware that there are health downsides from air pollution, things that we didn't necessarily know a century ago. So today, the actual number of objectives that we'd like utility regulation to take into account and address has actually expanded quite a bit, but the regulatory model itself hasn't quite evolved to keep up with that. So you can go on to the next slide, Janelle. That gets us to where we're going to be going today. So before we jump into reform, specifically, I wanted to talk a little bit about the utility business model, because you'll hear that term, or at least if you talk to RMI folks, you'll hear that term quite a lot, that we need to reform the utility business model. So one question that I think comes up a lot is, okay, what does that actually even mean? Well, a business model is just the way that a firm makes money. And investor-owned utilities are for-profit businesses, and so money matters to them. And so basically the utility business model influences what decisions they make and therefore what outcomes they result, and that affects all of us. And unlike in the private sector where the business model is a bit more flexible, the utility business model is actually determined in large part by regulatory policy. So if you want to look at changing the business model, probably the most efficient way to do that is to look at changing the regulatory model. Next slide. Now, traditionally, investor-owned utilities have been compensated under a cost of service regulatory model, and this is sometimes also called a rate of return regulatory model. There's basically 4 steps traditionally to setting rates under this traditional model. The utility will come in and file an application to raise its rates when it chooses to, and the regulatory commission that oversees it at the state level, Public Utility Commission, will open a rate case. And I realize this is really basic. A lot of folks probably already know this, but it's helpful as kind of a framework for what comes next. Number 2, the PUC will determine the utility's revenue requirement, which basically just means what is its cost of service? What cost does it need to actually incur to serve customers? Then number 3, the PUC will set rates that will be charged to customers to allow the utility to recover that revenue requirement based on what it expects to sell in terms of electricity or gas or what have you. And those rates, once they become insufficient to recover the utility's costs, for example, because of inflation or because of other changing conditions, you just rinse and repeat. You go back to step 1 and the utility comes in for another rate case. The basic formula for the revenue requirement is shown below. The revenue requirement, again, is just the estimated cost of service for the utility, and that does include a return to investors as well as just compensation for its ongoing expenses. So the basic pieces are first rate base times rate of return. Rate base is the undepreciated stock of capital investment from the past. So all the poles, the wires, the generating plants, substations, all that kind of stuff. Whatever customers haven't yet paid off through depreciation through rates is in the rate base, and also some other stuff. But basically that's what the rate base is. It's that capital investment piece. And then the utility basically gets to earn a return for its investors on the rate base. And the reason for that is because the rate base represents capital that the utility has borrowed from private lenders and equity investors. So basically that rate of return is going to include the interest on debt as well as a return on equity for those investors that's set by the commission. And then to that you add operating expenses. So that's kind of the more ongoing expenses, vegetation management, fuel, things like that, that tend to be more constant over time. And so the utility also will basically be allowed to recover those, but there's no return explicitly attached to them in the rate making formula, or at least very little. There's a bit of a detail there, but for all intents and purposes, capital investment means the opportunity to earn that return, and also a profit, because generally that return for equity anyway is higher, is set higher by the commissions than the actual true cost of capital. So there's like a little bit of a gap there, sometimes more than a little bit of a gap, and that enables the utility to actually earn a profit for generally every dollar of capital investment that it makes. In contrast, operating expenses don't really earn a return for the utility, and therefore are not really a profit center for them. Now, cost of service, why is the rate, I am looking at the chat a little bit here. The rates can become insufficient to recover costs basically over time. Like one big reason would be inflation. If you have inflation and rates are fixed in terms of like dollars, over time, the actual amount that customers are paying goes down, and eventually the utility is going to probably not end up recovering enough money to actually cover its costs. Now, it might take a while, but basically conditions can change. That's what I meant by that, just as an answer. Okay, cost of service, as Laura already mentioned and described in some detail, does create some optimal outcomes. And the one I just described can be characterized, well, partly anyway, as CapEx bias. Basically this idea that because of this weird way that regulators actually set the revenue requirement, which is very different from how firms that are working in the competitive sphere earn their profits, The utility can profit off of CapEx, capital expenditures, but generally not off of OpEx or operating expenses. And therefore, you have something called CapEx bias, where there's an actual financial incentive for the utility to find ways to spend $1 of CapEx rather than $1 of OpEx. Another weird incentive that's very closely related is called gold plating. That's just the incentive to spend more CapEx. So you basically, if you can build more stuff, if you're a regulated utility, more poles, more wires, more plants, you get to earn a larger total return on that. And generally investors like that. So you have an incentive to do that. There's also some other things that come directly out of this formula. One is resistance to third-party and customer-owned solutions. Over decades now at this point, you may have noticed there's been a bit of a pushback from utilities against like solar, rooftop solar. And you could say there's various reasons for that, but I would say that a big one is that they don't earn any money off of those investments because customers make the capital investment, not the utility. Therefore, the utility, basically can look at distributed solar, at least customer-owned or third-party owned distributed solar, as a missed profit opportunity. If it can own that stuff, it's going to have the ability to earn something off of it, while if a customer does, it does not. There's also something called the throughput incentive, which effectively, well, basically that just means the incentive to sell more electricity or gas or whatever it is that the utility sells, because it is able to increase its profits by doing that. I don't want to get too in the weeds on that, but the basic idea is this comes out of how rates are set, and the fact that like things that are known as fixed costs, meaning that are fixed in at least the medium term, are recovered through volumetric rates. And so the utility can actually over recover fixed costs or recover more fixed costs by selling more power, say. And that's not great either. All these things are the reason that we're highlighting this is that there are reforms that can help address each of these suboptimal outcomes. And one in particular that we're not going to go into detail on, but that directly addresses the throughput incentive is called revenue decoupling. So we could talk about that more in the Q&A if desired. Then finally, information asymmetry. That's suboptimal. That doesn't totally go away when you move away from cost of service, but basically information asymmetry is just the fact that the utility generally knows more about its business than the regulator or other stakeholders do. And so therefore, the utility can sometimes get away with things without, the regulator being able to, catch them and say, no, you got to do it this way, the better way instead. So there is this information asymmetry. Quite a bit of performance-based regulation is structured to try to align incentives so that the utility is actually incentivized to do the right thing, like find the cheaper solution, for instance. And therefore, you can kind of sidestep the information asymmetry a bit, because the utility through its behavior will kind of reveal, or this is the idea anyway, will reveal perhaps, what the cheapest solution is, or that sort of thing. This also sets up cost of service regulation does set up some risk aversion. I mean, basically, if you get your costs back plus a rate of return, that's a pretty kind of sure thing. Why bother to try new things? Why bother to innovate? What's the benefit in that? You may not get your expenses recovered. You're not going to earn any more profits. Why bother? So it does set up a system that encourages utilities to be risk averse. Finally, you can end up with frequent rate cases. And this comes from the fact that if rates become insufficient to recover costs, what does the utility have to do? It has to come in and file a new application to raise rates. So that's one final thing about this whole system that isn't great. And there are luckily various reforms that you can implement to address each of these. Okay, I'm not going to address, probably return to the other question in the Q&A, just to kind of keep moving. But feel free to keep typing questions into the chat. And if folks want to try to answer each other's questions, by all means, you're welcome to do that as well. Okay, so regulatory reform is possible. A better world is possible. So we're not stuck with cost of service forever. There is hope. So performance-based regulation, PBR, is what we're mostly here to talk about today. And the basic idea of PBR is that you're trying to align utility incentives better with the interests of customers and broader society. Now, PBR, for the most part, does this by compensating utilities based on what you actually want them to do rather than on what they spend, and also by removing some of those perverse incentives that we just talked about, like CapEx bias, gold plating, the throughput incentive, that kind of thing. It's important to note that PBR is not just a single thing. So it's not like you either have PBR or you don't have PBR. PBR is actually a whole collection of tools that can be applied in different ways. And there's different variations, different combinations. And so it gets kind of complicated, but not just one thing. It's more of like a range of different possibilities. Now, just to note, PBR, oops, not quite yet. PBR is synonymous with the term incentive regulation, which you might see out in the world. Sometimes people call this incentive regulation. Now, really, all regulation is incentive regulation. You might have heard that too, and I think that is true. Cost of service obviously creates incentives, but that term incentive regulation is sometimes used as a synonym for PBR. However, there's another term you might see, which is alt-reg, or alternative regulation, which is actually broader. Alt-reg is an umbrella term for alternatives to cost of service regulation, and it includes PBR, but it also includes some other tools that exist for purposes other than trying to improve utility incentives. And one example that we're not going to get into in detail, but I'll just mention, is an earnings sharing mechanism. Some of you may be familiar with that concept. A lot of times what you have is a mechanism that is involved or included in a multi-year rate plan that's basically there to kind of share excess profits, or sometimes excess kind of like excess is not usually the word, but basically if the utility's earnings are higher or lower than expected, to enable customers to share the benefits or bear those additional costs with the utility. And the point of that is to reduce risk. It's not actually to improve utility incentives. Therefore, it's not PBR. It actually, an ESM will actually undermine a bit the incentive under the multi-year rate plan to contain costs. So it's not PBR, but a lot of times if you're talking about a PBR framework, there will be elements, other regulatory elements, both from cost of service, certainly, as well as from alt-reg, that will appear in there, even if they themselves are not PBR. So just kind of trying to get on the same page with that terminology there. Next slide, and on to Janelle.
Yeah, so thanks for setting that up, Kaya. As Kaya mentioned, because PBR and alt-reg, regulatory reform generally, refers to a suite of mechanisms, a collection of tools, if you will. It can be implemented in a variety of ways, on a spectrum from, really comprehensive performance-based regulation to more incremental performance-based regulation. And so this is just a cute cartoon slide to show, as an example, Hawaii is a state that has taken a very comprehensive approach and really fundamentally transitioned away from the cost of service framework, whereas states like North Carolina have taken a more incremental approach and still have a lot of elements of cost of service legacy in their PBR framework enacted in statute. So what is comprehensive PBR framework? I think different folks will have different impressions, but RMI defines comprehensive PBR as a regulatory framework that has 4 key elements, or as seen on these pillars. So 1 is to incentivize cost efficiency. 2 is to remove the throughput incentive. And as Kaya mentioned, we at RMI think the best way to do that is through revenue decoupling. 4th is to incentivize targeted outcomes. That's where PIMs can come into play, but also other mechanisms can create incentives for certain outcomes as well. And then 4th is to equalize the CapEx and OpEx incentives. And so Kaya was talking earlier about how utilities they have the CapEx bias. They're incentivized to invest in $1 in CapEx rather than $1 in OpEx. Creating some balance and creating incentives where OpEx is an equally attractive alternative for utilities is actually something we think is really important to be included in a comprehensive PBR framework. But at the end of the day, there's no one size fits all regulatory framework, PBR or otherwise, for states. Instead, states should think about participating in processes that will help them consider and prioritize unique objectives for pursuing reform. And on this slide are a variety of questions that you can consider to help understand what the priorities might be in your specific context. So in Virginia, what are the key things that are not currently incentivized in the current framework that need to be incentivized or should be incentivized to be consistent with policy goals and objectives? So I'll go ahead. This slide is going to be available to folks after the presentation. So I'll go ahead and move us on to the next slide, where we can dig a little deeper into thinking about a process to design and effectively figure out what the key goals, outcomes, and intended objectives are for a PBR framework should be. And I'll say that, I'm talking about this within the context of designing an overarching PBR framework, so at a macro level. But this same principle also applies when you're thinking at a micro level about designing a specific PIM. So every PBR process, including those that are focused on PIMs exclusively, should start with a clear articulation of what the goals for reform are supposed to achieve. Goals should describe desired change or in-state utility regulation, but will likely be too broad to be measured. So an example of a goal is improve utility operations or better meet customer needs. The next step is to identify the regulatory outcomes PBR should produce to track progress towards those established goals. Outcomes should be observable and measurable. They should be more narrow and represent how the power sector is experienced by customers and market participants, as well as the larger economy and society. And they can vary, from DER adoption to utilization or reliability, affordability, GHG emissions and reductions. There's a whole span of potential topics, which we'll have a slide on in just a minute, that would be great for PBR outcomes. And finally, metrics are specific measurable mechanisms that quantify performance. So an example of a metric for affordability is average monthly bills for residential customers in dollars. A similar, a metric example for GHG reduction might be the CO2 emissions avoided by electrification of transportation or buildings. So really quickly, metrics can come in three flavors. They can be activity-based, program-based, or outcome-based. Activity-based metrics track utility actions or a step that the utility takes to ultimately lead to or impact a desired outcome. And so for an example of this is the number of informational pamphlets or sent to customers, or the number of phone calls picked up in a timely manner, customer service calls. Program-based metrics, in contrast, track the performance of a specific utility program. So it might be megawatts enrolled in a demand response program or the percent of customers on a TOU rate. Outcome-based metrics, in contrast, focus on whether the actual outcome is achieved rather than focusing on the specific actions that were taken to deliver that outcome. So an example of an outcome-based metric would be peak demand reduction in kilowatts or megawatts. So what I want to emphasize here is that, we have a bias at RMI towards outcome-based metrics because they create space for the utility to make its own decisions about how best to achieve the outcome. When you have program-based metrics or even activity-based metrics, more so, the utility is more constrained in terms of how they achieve the objective. And that constrained path they are forced to take through the design of the metric may not be the least cost path. So I want to give utilities the opportunities to find the best way to get from point A to point B. So I'll invite you guys to consider and type your answers in chat the following question. What are some of the high-level goals and objectives you would hope that PBR can support in Virginia? And acknowledging that, this webinar is meant to support you all in thinking about a PIMS metrics and scorecards process, invite you to think more specifically about outcomes or objectives you hope PIMS can support. So I'll pause for a second while folks type some responses in. All right, increased non-wires alternatives deployment. That's definitely a big one, and starting to see a few mechanisms across the country and other jurisdictions on non-wires alternatives. Seeing some incentivized investments in clean, firm power. Yeah, that's a great one, and it's going to be super important for a least cost decarbonized future. Peak demand reduction, absolutely. Major driver of utility costs and CapEx spending, for sure. Reducing overall energy demand and greenhouse gas emissions, improving energy efficiency outcomes. Love it. The energy efficiency space, I'll note, is definitely has been a space where PIMs have been used for a long period of time. I think as many as like 30 years, there's been PIMs in the US focused on energy efficiency. And my colleague Rachel Gold and I recently wrote a white paper last summer that was talking about the transition or the evolution of energy efficiency PIMs from PIMs that are focused, on savings and BTU therms, to PIMs that are more focused on using energy efficiency as a resource to support decarbonization. So if that's of interest, happy to share that after the call. Maintaining reliability without adding carbon emitting generation. Love it. Awesome. Well, it sounds like y'all have a lot of ideas about how you can, what outcomes can be supported in Virginia through the development of PIMs, scorecards, and metrics. So really excited to help y'all think about that in the next couple of sections. So with that, I'm going to transition it back over to Kaya.
All righty. So, okay, let's dive into some particular tools. Next slide. And I'm watching the chat too. Yeah, there's a lot of good discussion going on there. Good ideas. Okay, so there's a whole series of regulatory reform tools that we would consider to be key, meaning that they're important. This is not all the tools that are out there, but this is kind of the ones that we consider important to know about for like a 101 level anyway. Some of these are PBR tools and some of them are alt-reg. As I discussed earlier, everything here is alt-reg, only some of it's PBR. I'm not going to go through most of these in detail just for reasons of time, but so these boxes highlight the places that I'm going to focus in just a few minutes on. But basically PBR tools, including revenue decoupling, well, MRPs actually are going to, multi-year rate plans will be discussed a bit by the next presenter today. Metrics and scorecards, I'll talk a little bit more about those as well as PIMs. Benchmarking, CapEx, OpEx equalization also can be useful. We're not going to go into depth on that, but all these non-highlighted items on here, when you get the slides, which I'm not sure if that's happened yet or if that'll be in the future, we do have slides included on all of these, so you can on your own take a look at that material and like Janelle said, follow up with questions. Under the alt-reg column, I already mentioned ESMs, earnings sharing mechanisms. Again, not going to go into deep depth on those, but there's going to be information in the deck. Forward test years. Cost trackers we will talk a bit about just because this is certainly an issue in Virginia. So wanted to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of cost trackers. And then there's also something called formula rates, which is basically like a broad-based cost tracker, which hopefully is not something you have to worry about, but is not generally something that we recommend as a great solution to the problems of cost of service, but it's good to know that they exist. So yeah, with that, let's move on to those highlighted tools. So metrics and scorecards. So Janelle already talked a bit about metrics. Scorecards are very similar to metrics. A metric is basically a specific quantifiable measure used to assess performance in a particular dimension. And a scorecard basically pairs, it should be a reported metric with a performance target. And generally what that means is you have like, say you have, if you're tracking reliability, you might have a metric, like a classic one would be SAIDI. So you're looking at the duration of interruptions. And then a scorecard could be, okay, here's the utilities SAIDI for this year, and how does that compare to the average SAIDI for this part of the country or something like that, or a peer group of utilities and to past years for that utility. So a scorecard normally will basically display the information in a metric in a way that kind of puts it into context. It shows it in relation to a target. It oftentimes will appear on like a utilities website in a public facing way, something like that. So benefits for these are primarily they increase transparency and to some extent reduce information asymmetry because you can better see how the utility is performing in certain dimensions. And compared to PIMs, which we'll talk about in a second, generally the stakes for getting metrics and scorecards wrong are a bit lower just because there's no financial incentive attached. And you can use metrics and scorecards to gather information that later could be used to construct a PIM. So maybe you're not quite ready yet to come up with a performance incentive mechanism because you're saying, well, this is kind of a new area. We haven't gathered a lot of data. We're not really sure what good performance means. you can track that for now. And then maybe a few years down the road, you, and by you, I mean like obviously the regulator, may decide that it's time to actually attach a financial incentive to that metric and turn it into a PIM. And we'll get more to PIMs in a second. Obviously, collecting data does involve some costs. So even though there's no financial incentive attached to a metric or scorecard, they're not completely free, but they certainly are a bit simpler than like a PIM. Next slide. So now PIMs, as I think everybody here already knows, basically tie utility revenues to some desired outcome. So basically what a PIM is just a financial incentive of some kind tied to a metric. And generally that does mean there's also some kind of a target. You generally have a sense of like, this is good performance, that's not. But PIMs can be structured in a variety of ways, and not all of them have one fixed threshold as a target. It's more a matter that there is some idea of what good performance means that is at least implicit, if not explicit, in the PIM. So just as a few ways that PIMs can be structured, for example, you could have a PIM that applies a penalty to the utility if it fails to achieve some outcome. So back to our reliability example, maybe if it fails to achieve this level of SAIDI for a given year, it's going to have a penalty to pay, and its shareholders will have to bear that.
Hey,
you could
Kaya,
also, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Just so that all the listeners are on the same page, can you just define SAIDI for all of us?
Yeah, SAIDI is system average interruption duration. Oh boy. SAIDI is basically one of the classic reliability measures that looks at the duration of average duration of interruptions across the utility system. There are some other metrics that are also classic, SAIFI and KD being the other two that are kind of show up the most. Those three are interrelated, but it's basically for intents and purposes here, the important thing is that it is a pretty, it's a metric with a very long track record that is something that a utility would already have available, and a regulator could basically take out of the box and use as a PIM in a pretty uncontroversial manner compared to some other more emergent outcomes.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, then thank you. And Janelle is helping me define that. Yeah, system average. Yeah. Sometimes it's hard to remember what the acronyms stand for, you know, but that's basically what it is. Okay, so yes, so back to different ways that PIMs can be structured. Another structure is to basically attach an incremental incentive over a range of outcomes. So what does this mean? It means, like, for instance, for energy efficiency, you might say, okay, utility, for every kilowatt hour you save through this energy efficiency program, you will be able to earn, you know, this many cents or parts of a cent on for every kilowatt hour that you save, something like that. Another option is for the utility to earn a share of the estimated savings from implementing some alternative. That's known as a shared savings mechanism. I know somebody earlier mentioned non-wires alternatives, and you oftentimes will see, or at least sometimes will see, this type of mechanism applied in that context, where there's usually a traditional solution like, okay, you know, demand is rising, we're going to need to build more, you know, another transmission line or whatever, based on our expectations of demand going up in the next 10 years. But there might be other solutions. There may be like an energy efficiency and demand response programs you could implement instead and avoid that investment. And then basically a shared savings mechanism will be implemented to allow the utility to capture a share of that savings. So say that you spend $5 rather than $10, you know, alternative solution costs half as much, the utility would actually be able to capture a part of that. Maybe it gets half of the savings and customers get half of the savings, so everybody wins to some degree. And it incentivizes the utility to actually try to find savings opportunities. As a general rule, PIMs should be designed to deliver net benefits. The idea here is definitely not to pay more to get, you know, an outcome than you would have to in the absence of a PIM. Performance-based regulation should be performance-based. It shouldn't be perks and bonuses regulation. So, you know, it's important to design these things carefully. And really, your rewards should not be larger than needed. The utility will probably disagree with me on that, but basically, if you can pay a utility $1 incentive to do something that you want, don't pay it $3. You know, $1 is the way to go. So the purpose here is to improve outcomes and basically better serve customers and broader society, better achieve policy goals, not to you know, just kind of pad the utility's bottom line. So did I cover the stuff on the right hand, or did we need to Is that a gentle nudge to move on? Okay, let me just take a quick look here. Yeah, I think everything else over there is pretty self-explanatory. Basically, PIMs can be complicated to design. Okay, you can move on. So just putting these three tools in context with each other, metrics, scorecards, and PIMs are all very closely related. Metrics, as we've already discussed, are just what you're measuring. Scorecards are what you're measuring plus some kind of a target, very oftentimes displayed in some public-facing way. PIMs are basically a metric plus a target plus some financial incentive. So the really defining quality of a PIM is there is a financial incentive attached. So a proceeding that's looking at metrics could easily then kind of lay the groundwork for one that looks at scorecards and perhaps at that time or later PIMs as well. Next slide. There are a range of outcomes that are appropriate for PIMs. So as you know, there were a lot of ideas put in the chat earlier about different things that folks would like to perhaps incentivize in Virginia. And the good news is, yeah, you can design a PIM to do maybe not quite everything, but there's a lot of flexibility when it comes to PIM designs. They are metrics and PIMs are some of the, and scorecards are some of the most flexible PBR tools that there are. So you can really use a lot of creativity and you know, kind of creative problem solving there to address a whole variety of outcomes. Next slide. Okay, now just a word about cost trackers. As I mentioned before, these are not PBR. These are a form of alt-reg. And why is it a form of alt-reg? Well, because traditionally, remember, the utility will have its base, or let me step back, there'll be the revenue requirement set, and regulators will then set rates on a forward-looking basis. Something just happened with the display there. Okay. And basically, the utility will recover its costs through these rates that are not basically trued up afterwards. Cost trackers are different. They basically track costs. Now, what does a cost tracker does? It recovers some specific category of costs outside of a rate case based on some kind of formula or some kind of pre-existing rule. So you set up a cost tracker and then you kind of let it run with some oversight, certainly, but not usually as in-depth oversight as you would get through, say, a rate case. Cost trackers do work differently than the base rates set during rate cases. Base rates are forward-looking. They are set in advance to recover expected costs, and they are not trued up later under the traditional model. Cost trackers, however, are backward-looking. They track actual utility spending. So the utility spends something, and then basically that cost later will show up on your bill, or perhaps a true up to whatever was included in base rates originally will show up on your bill. Usually there is some review of the costs that are recovered through trackers. It's not like the utility has, you know, complete flexibility to charge whatever it wants, but more often than not, those costs are not reviewed in the same depth that would be in a rate case, and you can end up with cost trackers that really make it very easy for the utility to recover costs, and that is a bit of a problem from the customer's perspective. So benefits of cost trackers, they do ensure timely recovery of costs, and sometimes that's what you want. They can reduce rate case frequency because they reduce what's known as regulatory lag, which is, you know, if there's inflation or something and, you know, the rates that were set are not keeping up with that, you can end up with more rate cases. Cost trackers can reduce that. So, and utilities like them because they reduce the risk of unexpected outcomes from its perspective. But drawbacks, the really big one is that cost trackers don't create very good cost containment incentives. Part of that is because they reduce regulatory scrutiny, or most of them do anyway. And I will just say that capital cost trackers in particular are potentially problematic because insofar as they enable the utility to more easily recover capital costs, that can encourage more capital spending. And capital spending is obviously something that the utility is incentivized already to do more of because of CapEx bias and gold plating. Next slide. Okay. Alrighty. So cost trackers should basically be used carefully. There has been a trend nationwide towards the use of cost trackers, more cost trackers over the last couple of decades. Sometimes these do make sense, but oftentimes they do create problems, and they can undermine the effectiveness of certain other PBR tools. One would be the cost containment incentive created by MRPs. Anything you track is not going to be covered by like a revenue cap or whatever index that you're using to escalate revenues during a multi-year rate plan. So cost trackers can actually become a bit of a problem in that context. So basically, regulators should be careful to try to avoid some of these unintended consequences by considering the incentives created by cost trackers carefully, both at upfront and then periodically thereafter, and also thinking about using other ways to incentivize cost control. Okay. And I think this is back to Janelle.
Yeah, thanks, Kaya. So now that we've talked through metrics, scorecards, PIMs, we're going to transition to talk about some PIM examples that you can find out in the wild. So one PIM I just wanted to share with folks is the RPSA PIM in Hawaii. This is a PIM that was created with the intention of encouraging the utility to exceed the RPS statute in Hawaii. And so the utility is eligible to receive a positive incentive. So it's a reward only mechanism where if the megawatt hours produced in a year, if the percentage of megawatt hours produced in a year from renewable resources exceeds the interpolated straight line between RPS goal years, then the utility gets either a $20, $15, or $10 per megawatt hour reward, depending on the time frame. So the value of the reward is lower in future years than it was in earlier years. And that's just to reflect that it's more valuable to reduce emissions in the near term. And of course, this mechanism may be renewed in future years. There is a downside incentive associated with the RPS already, but that's in statute. And so the utility is in goal years required to pay a fine if they are not achieving the RPS. In New York, there is a beneficial electrification earnings adjustment mechanism. And, this is just New York's way of creating a whole nother acronym that is the same thing as a PIM. So this PIM was adopted in 2019, and it's to encourage Con Edison to promote efforts that will result in the adoption of beneficial electrification technologies, such as electric vehicles and heat pumps. And the adoption of those technologies are meant to lead to a decrease in lifetime carbon emissions on a marginal emissions basis. So Con Edison tracks their EV registrations within their service territory using DMV vehicle registration data. And then to calculate the emissions reductions from EVs, they estimate that by multiplying the number of EVs registered in a year times the average annual mileage for EVs times the difference between the metric tons of carbon emissions that are associated with driving 1 mile in an ICE, internal combustion vehicle, times the useful life of a registered battery electric vehicle. The reason why I got into all that detail is just to highlight how complex it can be to figure out, okay, well, how are we going to measure this? What does it mean to track the lifetime tons of avoided carbon dioxide? And that is often, like someone said earlier, the devil is in the details. That is often where the devils present themselves. So it's really important to be intentional and thinking through, okay, if we are gonna create a PIM focused on a certain outcome, what are the range of metric options that we could consider? And then how would we measure each of these? And there's often going to be many different ways to measure a given metric. And there'll be lots of contentious debates likely in those conversations to figure out what's the right way to do it. There's some other details on this slide about the PIM's design, but I'm going to gloss over it in the interest of time. Another PIM example is the Rhode Island System Efficiency Incentive. The metric for this PIM is the megawatts of annual peak capacity savings that are shed across all customer categories. And capacity is defined as a reduction in total demand in the annual peak hour of demand for ISO New England. And so the list of eligible resources for this PIM include demand response, so smart thermostat program calculated by a use of deemed megawatt reduction credit factors, There's incremental net metered behind the meter, solar PV, distributed generation, that to the extent that that's in excess of company forecast levels, that's calculated and considered as part of this peak demand reduction. Incremental installed energy storage capacity, and any additional actions that National Grid can identify to reduce peak demand, which can also include non-wires alternatives that are expected to influence system peak that are not already captured under this metric or others. It could also include third-party partnerships to provide peak reduction solutions. So there's a range of ways under this mechanism where that was intentional in the design to make sure that the utility had a suite of options to consider in how it was going to reduce peak demand. Lastly, I'll close with an affordability PIM that was recently approved in Illinois. This PIM is intended to reduce the number of customer disconnections in the areas within Con Ed service territory that have the highest rates of historic disconnections. And so this PIM, there is a reward for reducing disconnections between north of 6.7% relative to historical baseline. There's a deadband between 3.3% and 6.7% reduction, which means if the utility reduces disconnections by 5%, they won't get a reward, but they also won't be penalized. And they are penalized if they fail to reduce disconnections in these specific areas by less than 3%. And the incentive is designed as a plus or minus 5 ROE basis points. So with that, I'm going to turn that over to questions, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just flag that, I talked through just now a variety of PIM examples in other jurisdictions. I think I covered 4, but there's hundreds. And one of the efforts that I'm leading with colleagues at RMI is to put together a public resource or a database of PIMs that are in place in other jurisdictions, so that if you're curious and like, what are other states doing on peak demand reduction? I want to see more than just the one Janelle showed in this presentation. That might be a resource in the future that could be helpful to you in understanding a full spectrum of ways to design a PIM for peak demand reduction or any other category. And that resource, just FYI, is not available yet, but it hopefully will be soon. So watch this space.
Thank you, Janelle, so much, and Kaya for this really excellent presentation. What we're going to do, how we're going to structure this is we want to kind of have break for a short, maybe like 8-minute period of Q&A with the audience right now before we move into Nick's presentation, so folks can kind of follow up on the burning questions they had arising from your presentations. And so we've seen a bunch of really good questions pop up in the webinar chat already that I can highlight. But first, I've got a kind of back to basics question that I want to kick off with, and one of your pillars for PBR said that it's important to equalize CapEx and OpEx incentives. And I was wondering if you all could give an example of a really important OpEx expenditure, or like say a little bit more about why. I mean, we understand that on the CapEx side, we want to avoid gold plating, but can you talk a little bit more about the importance of some of those OpEx expenditures?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on this one. So there's a wide variety, but as one example, if you pay a third party for a service and the third party invests capital, that will look at like OpEx from the utility's point of view. So generally, if a third party makes an investment, say in renewable energy or in maybe like cloud computing, for instance, usually the utility will then pay, it'll have a contract where it will pay the same amount every month or what have you on some kind of ongoing basis. A PPA would be another example. And so that looks like OpEx from the utility's perspective. And that OpEx can be a direct substitute for the utility's own spending. So the utility with CapEx bias has an incentive to make its own investments rather than going the route of engaging with a third party, even if the third party alternative is cheaper or better, or, in the case of say cloud computing, can be upgraded more regularly by people who actually specialize in, IT rather than the utility's kind of in-house IT team that may not be as on the cutting edge. So.
Great. Thank you, Kaya. I want to highlight, because I don't think we're having folks come off mute here. I think we're in webinar mode here, so I'll just read the questions. But Albert Pollard, hello, Albert, a while back asked a question. He wants to explore the utility incentive more, and how would a regulator determine like what incentive is enough, particularly if like we're coming from a cost of service model where the utility is kind of essentially giving up guaranteed income. How do you incentivize the utility in that situation?
Janelle, do you want to jump in on this one with some thoughts? I think she's saying no. Yes.
You go first, Kaya, and then I'll jump.
Okay. I mean, I think this is a big question and it's a rather complicated one. I'm hearing kind of two questions here. Hearing, how do you get the utility on board with PBR, you know, if it's kind of comfortable where it is? And I'm also hearing, how do you actually determine the size of the incentive, like when you're designing a PIM? Those aren't quite the same question. They're both important though. For getting the utility on board, I mean, kind of at the most basic level, I'd say, well, there's two things. If the regulator's bold enough, they can just say, hey, we're going to do this, and that's that. So basically mandate it and go ahead and move to a more of a PBR framework. In most cases, the utility does have some political power and, you know, will have some sway there. So a lot of times the approach, you know, probably needs to involve some, you know, figuring out win-win situations where the utility can benefit as well as ratepayers. For instance, like a PIM, a shared savings mechanism, for example, if the utility could like find a cheaper solution, do something differently than it's doing now, and it could actually capture some of those savings, it can basically benefit its investors, it can raise its dividends that year or whatever. So sometimes you can make that case too, that hey, like there's something in it for you too. For the PIM and the incentive size question, maybe Janelle, do you want to hop in on that piece of it?
Yeah, sure. It's really complex, Albert. And I think that is deserving of an entire conversation, hour-long, maybe more conversation, to think about how you figure out what is the right incentive size. I will say that the NARUC PBR working group, if you go to their webpage, they have what I think is a really excellent webinar available that you can watch on YouTube that is focused on setting incentives. And so maybe in the interest of addressing some other questions, I'll point you to that resource, and we can follow up offline if you have further questions and want to talk about it more.
Actually, can I add one more piece to this that might be of interest? For some incentives anyway, say like specifically CapEx bias and gold plating, those perverse incentives, those are driven by the fact that the allowed return on equity is generally quite a bit higher than the true cost of capital. So if you can reduce the allowed return, you know, that the one that's built into rates, and convince the regulator to bring that down a bit, you actually weaken those incentives, and that also could perhaps make the utility more receptive to moving to something that's more performance-based. So just one more other idea to throw into the mix.
So a lot of the questions, there's more than one question in the chat about interconnection, and I think a lot of this is driven. I know we've got some solar folks in the audience today, and so I'm actually going to pick out Michael Downey's question specifically because I think it's a good one. So to what degree has Hawaii's performance incentive mechanism around accelerating interconnection and any other efforts to accelerate interconnection using PBR mechanisms, have these been effective? What can we do to make them effective?
Yeah, so I'll take this one. One of the key challenges with PIMs that everyone should just be aware of straight off the bat is that it's really hard to determine whether or not a PIM itself has been successful. So even if the utility, you know, it meets the target, earns a reward, was it the PIM itself that encouraged that mechanism, or is it a variety of other factors happening in the ecosystem that could have informed or influenced that, right? Like we've got a new suite of incentives for interconnection of distributed solar for customers from the IRA. Like it's really hard to divorce and all of the things that are happening in this space, and they're happening really quickly, and say like, in isolation, this PIM was responsible for improving performance in this area. And the reason I say that is because in Hawaii's example, at the time that the commission approved the DER interconnection approval PIM, which is a PIM designed to spur the utility to reduce the time it takes from the time the customer files an application for interconnection to the time that the distributed resource is energized. At the same time that that PIM was approved, the utility itself was undergoing process improvements to streamline its services in connecting customers' distributed resources. So the utility has, for the last 2 years, exceeded their targets for the DER interconnection approval PIM. But that's an example of where it's important to be thinking about the context. If the utility is known to be doing something in the area, that might not be the right time to establish a PIM. It might be better to establish a suite of metrics so you can see whether their efforts to improve performance on that outcome are sufficient. And then if they're not, after a few years, you can observe and say, okay, they still aren't improving their performance sufficiently, in my opinion. So we need to create an incentive to make them do that.
Great. Thanks so much, Janelle. I'm getting messages now that it's unfortunately time to move into the second half of our program. So I know there's a lot of good questions that went unanswered, and I know we could talk about this for several more hours. But without further ado, I want to introduce Nick Crowley. And Nick is a network industry expert. First I should say he's a senior economist at Christensen Associates Energy Consulting. Nick is a network industry expert specializing in electric and gas utility regulation. He also testifies on performance-based regulation issues, both in the US and in Canada. Nick has also filed reports on cost of service, cost of capital, and rate design issues. Welcome, Nick. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. And let me make sure that I can get my presentation to be shared here. One moment. Okay, so let me ask if everyone can see that presentation up.
We can.
Okay, great. Okay, so I have the challenge here of talking about something that we could talk about for a long time in just 15 minutes, and that is a particular area of performance-based regulation that is basically the widest definition of it, or widest term, would be like a multi-year rate plan. But in particular, I'm going to be talking about kind of ways to structure multi-year rate plans. And my reading of the stuff that's coming to Virginia is that this is not necessarily the top of mind category of performance-based regulation that is discussed in like the docket that's opening in July, but it's something that, from my perspective, is kind of like the behemoth in PBR. It's like the thing that most PBR contains is these multi-year rate plans with some kind of way of capping revenues or prices. And the goal there is all about cost minimization. So I'm kind of moving away from the world of PIMs and moving in the direction of this world of, okay, let's just focus on this one aspect of incentive regulation, which is how do we incentivize a utility to become more cost efficient? And what you heard in RMI's presentation was that under traditional forms of, actually, I'm just going to kind of move right along here and get to this slide where we kind of compare and contrast the conversation of performance-based regulation with the concept of traditional cost of service. So this is kind of a recap of what RMI was talking about at the beginning of their presentation, which is that under this traditional form of regulation, there's very low incentives for the utility to become efficient from a cost perspective. And the reason for that is because they are allowed to essentially recover whatever their costs are deemed to be prudently incurred. So any costs that they have over a 1 or 2 year period, they can come back and get those costs recovered through rates. But the concept of performance-based regulation in the form of multi-year rate plans is, let's extend that period of time between rate applications and give the utility a reason to seek cost-saving measures that they don't otherwise have if they're just able to recover their costs every year. So a lot of the concepts on this slide were discussed in RMI's presentation. I won't really say too much more other than that, yes, there's a few different tools in the world of incentive regulation, and then there's additional tools that are often brought into incentive regulation plans that aren't necessarily considered to be PBR, but we call them alternative regulation. I'll briefly mention just this stuff, which is again, like kind of talking about PBR more broadly. Usually when a jurisdiction or a regulator, hopefully a utility, is thinking about introducing incentive regulation, they are following some set of principles, guiding principles that are established ahead of time so that you can kind of compare how decisions are made against those principles. And this particular list of principles comes from the Alberta Utilities Commission, where PBR has been underway for well over a decade now, or at least for some utilities. Because this slide deck is going to be shared with everyone, I'm going to just pass over this because of the limited time that I have. But the basic idea is that there's a bunch of different principles that don't necessarily all work in unison at the same time. So there might be trade-offs between saying, okay, are we going to put more weight on, principle number 2, where you give the firm a reasonable opportunity to recover its costs, or are you going to put more emphasis on the last one, for example, where the PBR plan should make all parties better off relative to regulatory alternatives? So these are just things to consider as you're thinking about PBR in general, but also PBR in the form of multi-year rate plans. So why do we want to consider multi-year rate plans, and what do those multi-year rate plans look like? Well, this is kind of just, again, recapping what we've already said, which is that these textbook traditional ways of regulation have very low powered incentives in comparison to what we would call incentive regulation or pure PBR. Pure PBR is what I would call a form of regulation that has the longest period of time between truing up the costs with revenues. And the reason that that is a pure form of incentive regulation with high powered incentives is, again, that these companies will have the opportunity to seek cost saving measures, and they'll have an incentive to do so, which they wouldn't have if they were having to true up their rates every single year with their costs. So the idea is that over, like, let's say a 5-year PBR term, a utility is improving its efficiency, and then at the end of that term, what happens is the utility goes back in for a rate application, but has essentially reduced its costs over that 5-year plan because they've had an incentive, a profit motive to do so. And then when they come back in for their next rate application, their cost to serve and their revenue requirement is lower than it otherwise would have been under a traditional form of regulation. There are a number of benefits in addition to kind of improved cost saving incentives, and I'll just kind of highlight the last bullet here, which is that there is improved rate stability. I just saw an article yesterday that AEP Ohio is hiking rates like 28% this year, which is just extraordinary. And obviously nobody likes to see that. And so when you have index caps where there's a long period of time between rate applications, but there's also a revenue or a price adjustment happening during that period of time, then you have much greater rate stability both during the PBR term and between PBR terms, where a PBR term is just like the period of time between rate applications. And then the second thing about PBR is that in terms of consumer benefits is that consumers can share in the efficiency gains. And there's different ways that a PBR plan can be structured to ensure that that's the case. In the most pure form of PBR, you would basically see no you would basically see no like earnings sharing mechanisms, and that would enable the utility to have the highest form of incentives, so that between rate applications, prices are increasing at basically some nearly like the rate of inflation, and then between rate applications, and then during a rate application, you'd see rate hikes that are hopefully lower than what you'd see under traditional cost of service regulation. So I've kind of been speaking in general terms about what multi-year rate plans look like, but this slide gets at kind of the more concrete mechanics of, excuse me, I have something in my, I have a hair in my mouth. Okay, I've got it taken care of. So this slide is getting at kind of the more detailed mechanics of what a multi-year rate plan is. So multi-year rate plans exist in a number of different forms in a number of different places. So they're actually quite common in Canada. There are multi-year rate plans in British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario. There have been in Quebec. There's also multi-year rate plans in Massachusetts, Hawaii, and elsewhere. Most recently, I know that Duke Energy in, I believe, North Carolina filed a multi-year rate plan, but none of those are like exactly the same as each other. They all have kind of their own qualities and characteristics. But what I'm focused in this presentation about is a type of multi-year rate plan called indexed caps. Indexed caps refers to a couple of terms that you may have heard both either in the utility industry or in other industries like telecommunications, railroads. Actually, the US Postal Service has a price cap. So it's a general term that refers to price caps and revenue caps, and then also revenue per customer caps. And the basic idea behind an index cap plan is that either prices or revenues are set during a period of time according to the rate of inflation. And then also this thing called an X factor, which is essentially an adjustment to the rate of inflation to draw in information about what the industry's productivity looks like. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail on this slide. Now, I altered this slide right before the presentation today to put in this kind of what looks like kind of complex math. But I did so because I think it's helpful to look at, and I don't mean to make anyone like afraid of what's going on mathematically here, but I just want to highlight like the main concepts, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But basically, to recap, the I minus X formula is setting prices or revenues growth based on inflation or price growth minus this productivity offset. So if the utility industry as a whole is able to become more efficient, prices should be going down. That's kind of like the basic concept of how competitive markets work. If an industry becomes more efficient, prices go down. Think about like computers in the 2000s era, like chips were becoming much more efficient and prices were going down. So we're taking that concept and lending it to this industry that doesn't have competitive markets to put pressure on costs. So what you see on the right here is this derivation that says, let's take this competitive market concept of saying revenues should equal costs and apply it to a monopoly paradigm where you have a utility that doesn't have any competitive cost pressures. And so what you see in this derivation is that there's a way to set prices according to this competitive market condition, even if you can't, even if the utility doesn't have direct competitors. So what's going on with I minus X is that this bottom final aspect of the derivation is saying the utility's prices should change at the rate of inflation minus whatever the productivity is for that industry. I'll also say that these formulas may also include a growth factor, but we don't need to get into that at the moment. Let me just show this example of how it works, and then I'll ask if there's any questions, because I know that's kind of a lot to throw at everyone, and I'm speaking quickly, and it's maybe uncharted territory or new territory for some of the people that are listening today. So how does this I minus X formula get applied? Let's just take an example where I've kind of got this like illustrative table on the right here. Suppose that a utility comes in with its revenue requirement in year 1 of a PBR plan, where they've agreed that they will stay out, they will not ask for any adjustment to rates outside of the PBR plan for 5 years. So over those 5 years, what happens to its prices or its revenues, depending on whether you have a price cap or a revenue cap? Well, the answer is under, let's say a revenue cap. Let's say their revenue requirement is $1 billion, and I'm representing that in terms of millions here on the table. So like $1 billion. In the first year, they're allowed to recover revenues equal to that revenue requirement. Now, in year 2 and year 3 and year 4 and year 5, they are not allowed to come back and ask for additional revenue, but that revenue requirement is adjusted by this I minus X formula. So if the rate of inflation goes up 2% and the rate of productivity growth is negative, negative 1.5%, we'll say, then that means that the utilities revenue requirement can increase by a total of 3.5%. And that goes on over the course of the PBR plan. So the idea here is basically they're giving the utility the opportunity to lengthen the amount of time between rate applications, which does a number of things, including saving money on applications and regulatory burden, both for the utility and for all other stakeholders, including the regulator. But it also gives the utility an incentive to find efficiencies. And I don't have a slide in here on this, but I will say that I published a paper a couple of years ago in Utilities Policy that indicated that price caps in Alberta and Ontario actually did reduce the rate of escalation over the PBR periods relative to cost of service models. So the idea is that basically utilities are increasing their rates at something close to the rate of inflation, but that rate is much slower than it would have been if they had just been under a traditional form of cost of service regulation. So that is my very quick overview. I think I have a few slides in the appendix of a number of case studies where this is currently in effect. I know that it's also expanding in other places. Utilities are kind of starting to look at this and adopt it, and regulators, like for example, in British Columbia, Kaya was saying before, if a regulator is bold enough, they can just force you to do it. And the British Columbia Utilities Commission was bold enough, and they did force BC Hydro to pursue a revenue cap. And so they're working on that at the moment. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll get to questions, is highlighting this very, very key point, which is the second bullet point here, is that implementing a multi-year rate plan is not a panacea. It doesn't guarantee success, and that is an argument against my own incentive here, because I'm someone who's trying to be an advocate for multi-year rate plans. But the fact is that just because you set one up doesn't mean it's going to work, and you really have to think about how you design it. And as a stakeholder, you really need to focus on what are all the elements of the PBR plan. Don't just look at the X factor. Don't just look at the I factor. What else? What are their cost trackers? What are the ways that the utility is looking at making money? Because you can be guaranteed that they have spent a long time thinking about designing a plan that will be accepted, but will also make them money. So that's my advice, is to just be cognizant that the devil is in the details. You can't just look at the X factor and judge what the PBR plan will do for consumers.
Awesome, Nick. Thanks so much for your presentation. We've got about 5 minutes left to get through any additional questions. Let me just start by saying your advocacy for multi-year rate plans with indexed caps is very new to me, and I think a lot of Virginians would feel very. We kind of look at the history of our broken cost of service model in Virginia over the last several decades, frankly, where Dominion went without a rate review between 2014 and 2021. And we knew that our rates were inflated during that period. And in 2021, when the Virginia State Corporation Commission did finally get to review Dominion's rates and adjust those rates, of course, it was limited by statute into how far down it could adjust rates. And also that was the first time that the SCC in Virginia had gotten to actually set rates since 1992. And so a lot of us sort of have this PTSD about why would you want to extend the time between rate reviews? But I'm understanding fully that we weren't doing it with index caps and all of the other any other incentives, frankly. So I would caution for folks that we're talking about a totally different world in terms of what you're presenting. And so with that, I guess one question to kick us off here with the few minutes we've got left. I'll just start with, is there I know you said it's kind of in the United States, kind of this is in its infancy, but is there a gold standard that we can look to of maybe it's in Canada, or like the furthest along state in the US that is getting towards the model that you're describing?
That is a great question. It's a very difficult one to answer because PBR is evolving even in places where it has existed for a while. So like, for example, Alberta is in its 3rd generation PBR plan, but they are still changing and tweaking what they have as the set of rules and the way that PBR works there. So I don't know if I can tell you a gold standard. I tend to like my perspective is that the fewer cost trackers, the more pure your plan is overall, the better the incentives are, and hopefully that means that the better things will be for consumers. So like the National Grid Electric proceeding in docket 18-150 in Massachusetts, they had a very pure PBR plan, and they're coming to the end of it this year, but it's one where they just really didn't have cost trackers. They just had this kind of overall revenue requirement envelope, and it was all just under this I-X formula cap. And that meant that they weren't able to, recover costs in these like various side alleys in ways that you might be worried about in Virginia. So yeah, that might be where I might look. Alberta is okay, but their 1st generation plan had a very lucrative cost tracker, but also regulatory burdensome cost tracker system set up that I don't think anyone was very happy with. So no, I don't want to advocate for any one particular plan, but there are little pieces from plans all over that are probably good.
Great, thanks, Nick. With about a minute to spare on this webinar, first I want to plug this group, Clean Virginia App Voices, hosting this event today. We are trying to have another one of these discussions around September, so stay tuned. If you're able to join today, we'd like to have another dive on this topic in September as folks have gotten a chance to review the materials from today and drum up new questions. And then, so I guess, I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question today, with probably under a minute left here. I guess I would just ask, there was a really good question right at the start of Nick's presentation that I think Kaya answered in the chat, but I wanted to lift it up for everybody. And the question, I think, came from Carmen Bigham. It was about the timeline that it takes to implement PBR and PIMS in states that are doing it, and what to expect if Virginia were to go down this path. So maybe you can give us a 30-second answer to kind of tie a bow on this one. Kaya, if you're able to repeat what you said in the chat.
Yes. And I was responding to a different question in the chat. So can you please repeat your question? I'm sorry.
So the question is essentially what is the sort of expected timeline for full implementation of PBR and PIMS in states that are kind of the furthest ahead?
Yes, let's see, full PBR. So, full PBR depends what you mean by that, but a PIM can be implemented within a rate case. Sometimes that happens. That can make it maybe like a year or two. It could also be through a longer process. As Nick mentioned, a lot of times states will kind of evolve their PBR framework over time rather than going from nothing to everything. So sometimes it's even a little hard to say exactly when did the process start and end. If you already have a metric that you've established, and then you put like a financial incentive on it, your PIM design might take a year or two, maybe. But is that really the full process? So there's kind of some questions there. I'm not sure if that was helpful, but hopefully.
No, absolutely helpful. Well, thanks for staying a minute past 12:30 or so with us today. And I just really want to thank Laura and Kaya, Janelle, and Nick for your expertise today. Thank you so much for your presentations. Obviously, there's a lot more to dig into. People have got a ton of questions. The chat's blowing up and everyone's asking for everyone's email to continue these conversations. So thanks to our audience members for joining us. And thank you so much to our panelists today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Bye.